Take it.
I'll take it. All right. Thanks for joining us, everybody. We are live with Andrew Gold. How's it going, Andrew?
All good. Good to see you, man. You're looking hot in this new cool place you're in.
Yep. This is just a black painted wall for right now, but I got the palette wood ready to go up so I can keep my palette theme.
Wow.
And anyway, it's a more private recording area, so I can pretty much record whenever I want, wherever I want, without distractions, and that's what I've really been hoping for. So we're all set there. So let me just jump right into it, because there is some stuff I want to talk about, the stuff that the media did not tell you about this trial, and it's not because there's some grand conspiracy. It's because the media didn't know. That's the conspiracy. So do you remember early in the trial, maybe halfway through the testimony portion, there was a woman who was called out by the judge for taking very meticulous notes about the jury, and people were really weirded out about this. They thought maybe it was a Scientology agent. Do you remember that?
Yes. Yeah. Well, no, I don't, but I'm saying yes.
Yeah, so this was kind of a big deal because, Tony Ortega, in the notes that he was publishing 3 or 4 times daily from the article, one of the mornings he started out his notes by saying a woman came up and introduced herself, said she was a fan of the blog and was here to watch the trial. Okay. Mm-hmm. So then later on in the day, it updated that, one of the, do they call them bailiffs? The police officers who essentially work in the courtroom?
Believe so, yeah.
Had gone up to the woman and said, "What are you doing? Let me see your notes," and had her rip out pages of her notes, which was startling and kind of alarming. There's also literally no rules about what you're allowed to take notes on in a courtroom. This person had done nothing wrong. And then later, the courtroom took a break and the judge called her out personally and said, "Hey, what is your name?" Now, I don't believe any media outlets reported her name, and I'm not going to either. What's your name? I want everyone to leave the courtroom except for the attorneys and for you. And I was like, oh my God, what is going on here? And so they called her up, and we only know this. Well, I'll get to that in a minute. They called her up. They asked her, like, what are you doing this for? Are you doing it for yourself? It was one of the things where it's like, you're not doing anything wrong, but please don't do that. But it's totally okay if you do that. But please, we'd appreciate it if you didn't. But there's nothing wrong with it. Like, it was really weird, right?
Yeah.
Now, Tony had already reported earlier in the morning that it was, let's say, a fan of his. And when Tony's reported in the notes that this woman was called out by the judge, he also included in the information that it was that woman. And then at his end of day report, he said that he had caught up with her outside the courtroom, and she said that she hadn't spoken to any other reporters about what had happened because she was saving the scoop for him.
Uh-huh.
Now, here's the thing. Tony does not know what was in those notes. And the next morning before court began, Judge Almeida was having a sidebar with the defense attorneys and the prosecutors, and they called Tony Ortega up to speak with the sidebar. And Tony reported on this, and his readers celebrated it like it was some amazing, entertaining thing that Tony had been dragged into this thing, which honestly, I'm just, as a reporter, I don't know why that's something you want to celebrate. Becoming personally involved in something like this isn't exactly what a journalist is supposed to be doing. But I'm just saying it was celebrated like, oh, look how exciting it is. And yet Tony doesn't know why he was called up, and I do. And that's what I'm going to share with everybody. Tony doesn't know what was in the notes, but I know what was in the notes, which is what I'm going to share with everybody. And Tony doesn't know what would have happened if he had answered the judge's question a different way. So here's what happened. The notes wasn't just observations of how the jurors looked or anything like that. It was very detailed notes. First of all, it had, everything, every juror itemized by gender and approximate age and race. And it also included interesting details like what groups the jurors were breaking up into when they went off for meal breaks. That's some detailed stuff. And I think what Philip Cohen found most interesting about the notes is it include details of which way she thought every juror was leaning so far in the case. Tony doesn't know that's what was in the notes. Tony doesn't know that's why Philip Cohen wouldn't let go of the damn notes, and the judge was like practically having to pull the notes out of his hands. And at that time, her notes indicated that she thought only 6 of the jurors were leaning towards guilt, finding a guilty verdict, and that 4 of those jurors were still undecided, and that 2 of those jurors were leaning towards acquittal. Now, when the judge took these notes, she said, "We're going to file them under seal." But the next morning, and this is why Tony was called up, but he doesn't quite know it. The next morning, Philip Cohen was arguing that he wanted these notes unsealed, and his argument for making that request was that Tony's reporting on the matter made it seem highly likely that that woman was there at his request, at his direction, and that Tony already had a copy of the notes that were now under seal. And the argument was being made that if this woman did this for Tony Ortega and Tony's got the information, it shouldn't be under seal and it should be part of the public record. So they called Tony up and they didn't give him this context. All they asked him was, did you receive a copy of the notes that woman took in court yesterday? And Tony answered the truth. He said, no, I don't have a copy of them. And they were like, okay, thank you. You can go have a seat. If he had said yes, or if the answer had been yes, those notes would have been made public. That woman's identity would have been released to the public. It would have put her square in the crosshairs of everything. Now, and that is, so when I say what the media hasn't told you, I'm not just talking about the notes themselves. I'm talking about the fact that someone who was present in the courtroom making a fair observation of the proceedings and the jury has painted a different picture. That half the jury did not necessarily look like they were leaning towards guilt. And all of the reporting that has been done has sort of given us the impression this thing was a slam dunk. Mm-hmm. And we all know, I mean, even Tony has said over and over again, you never know what's going to happen. It's not a slam dunk. And I'm not saying that Tony said that. I'm saying the reporting of the testimony and the emotional impact of the testimony and how believable each witness was, not just the victims, but the witnesses. We've just always gotten the sense that this was relatively signed, sealed, and delivered. And, these notes from someone that was there paint a different picture. And I just think that is interesting to note.
Well, okay, you can't say who this person is, but I mean, this sounds like, to the untrained ear, perhaps the lay ear of mine, that this might be a Scientologist, right? Or some sort of cult person taking all little notes of everyone around the courtroom. Is that a reasonable guess?
Oh, no. I spoke to this person for a couple hours. I know who the person is. They're not a Scientologist at all. And they are a fan of Tony's. They are a reader of the Underground Bunker blog. But I don't think Tony should have published that in his notes for the day that, hey, someone just came up and said they're a fan of mine. Hey, that person who was a fan of mine was just called out by the judge. Hey, that person who was called out by the judge said she was saving the story just for me. Like I don't think that's part of, reporting on a case. I think that's making yourself a part of the case. And it seemed to me like it was almost being celebrated. Like, yay, isn't this great? Tony made himself a part of the case. Yay, Tony got called up by the judge. And you're like, is that your job? Is that what you're supposed to be doing?
To be devil's advocate here, not that Tony is a devil and I'm his advocate. If he hadn't reported that, you could criticize him just as much. Like, hang on, you were called up in the middle of the whole thing and that didn't even make it into your notes. What are you hiding, good sir?
Oh, no. I'm not talking about being whether you say you got called up or not. I'm talking about, like, for example, the person gave us the story because they said they were saving it just for us. The fact that you're the only one reporting the story, people could infer that the fact that you're the only one reporting the story speaks for itself. I'm just saying, advertising it just gave the defense ammunition to go to the judge and say, based on Tony Ortega's reporting, it looks like this woman was actually here for him, and it looks like he most likely has a copy of it. Now, he didn't. And I'm not making more of this than it really is. I'm just saying, I think it might serve as a lesson for how you don't necessarily want, as a journalist, to be making yourself a part of the story. But I don't mean he shouldn't have said he got called up by the judge. I'm saying in his daily notes, if Tony had not published in his notes, hey, we were sitting down this morning and the jury got started and a woman came up and told me she was a fan. Okay. If he hadn't said that, Philip Cohen never would have even ever knew this woman had anything to do with Tony on the internet or anything. Like it would have been a non-issue. Or in his notes, hey, the woman who got called out by the judge is the same woman who told us she was a fan. Well, okay. I mean, you're just giving information that has nothing to do with the case to the prosecutors. All I'm saying, it was just a thing. It was a thing. It's almost like there's two separate parts of the story. It's whether someone should be making them a part of the story or not. And it's the fact that I have what the media hasn't told you is that whatever happened in that courtroom was not as signed, sealed, and delivered as perhaps it has sounded. And the evidence speaks for itself. You have 10-2 voting to acquit on Jane Doe 1. You have 8-4, 8 voting to acquit on Jane Doe 2. 7-5, 7 voting to acquit on Jane Doe 3. And unless we are to believe that all of the jurors are just, stupid, ignorant cowards, which is not likely, then you sort of go, okay, perhaps what was going on in that courtroom and how it was observed by fair-minded people was somehow in some way different than what the written words have, the picture that's been painted by the written word alone. And that's why, I know there's reasons why there aren't cameras in the courtroom, but when the only window you have into the courtroom is a running, essentially just a running record of notes, and it's not an exact transcript either. I'm just saying there is room for, I don't want to say error because it's not error. It's just, if you're seeing it with your own eyes and ears, then you know exactly what's going on.
Yeah, there's room for bias. Yeah, no, well, I totally agree, and that's the interesting thing. We're never allowed, almost never, cameras and things into the courtroom in the UK compared to the US, and it's almost funny for me to be able to see, the Johnny Depp Amber Heard thing, for example, and you can actually see in the court. We can't do that. That's why you have those funny pictures that people draw of the people, because you don't get to actually see them in the court. And there are pros and cons to that, but I totally get what you're saying. Like, it just means you're getting a filter from the press. So what does this mean? And I'm going to ask you to speculate, and that's all we can do, really. But does this mean it just simply wasn't possible to prove something that happened 20 years ago? Or is there now doubt in your mind as to whether Danny Masterson may have done these things?
Oh, there's no doubt in my mind. I think it does come down. So, I have my own bias in the case, which is that I know that these things happened. I know the Scientology culture. I know these women aren't making it up. I know the role that the ethics officers played. I know Danny did this to these women. And yet, so sometimes when I'm talking about this, I'll use an example of when I served on a jury once. And there's a difference between what you know and what you can prove. And the 12 members on that jury weren't members of Scientology. They weren't members of the Sea organization. They don't know the culture. They don't know the reporting, the snitching culture. They don't know how unheard of it would be for 3 Scientologists to independently come up with false allegations. They don't know these things. So I have to remind myself, okay, put yourself in their shoes, just in a vacuum. And also remember, all of us, we know a lot more about the case than the jurors do, because there's rules about what the jurors are allowed to be informed about. We know everything that's out there. Okay. So in some respects, you can ask the question, how do you prove beyond a reasonable doubt that something occurred 20 years ago for which no physical evidence exists? How do you do that? Even if you believing someone is telling the truth is different than proving to someone else that someone is telling the truth.
Yeah. Did you know about this secret bit before yesterday? Did you know about what these notes and things and what the jury were looking like before yesterday?
Oh, I knew it the day after it occurred. I just wasn't going to say anything until after the trial was over.
Okay, yeah. So I suppose for you, yesterday's announcement of the mistrial was not such a shock.
Well, it was a shock in the sense that I had about a 90%. I had said publicly that I had about a 90% confidence level that they would come back with a conviction. Despite like, even if you had 6 people, even if a couple weeks ago you had 6 people leaning towards guilt and, 2 for acquittal and 4 undecided, I still had a high degree of confidence that the math was going to work out. And remember, this was before 2 of the jurors were swapped out, and I believed that the substitutions were actually positive for the prosecution and not good for the defense. So in some respects, it was a shock because I was like, wow, I was really hoping for a different outcome. But at the same time, I did have this other perspective that things were not necessarily as wrapped up as the reporting seemed to indicate. I was still holding on for hope, believe me. But yeah, no, it's been a 2 or 3 weeks. I'd have to go back. Whenever I was looking for Tony's notes on when exactly that occurred. But it was at least a week and a half before the Thanksgiving break. So we're talking close to 3 weeks ago. And this is the same person. This is the same person, by the way, who had, I'm going to say this delicately, okay, you were talking about the Johnny Depp trial a few moments ago. Can you imagine the difference of our perception of those proceedings if we had not been able to see and hear what that testimony sounded like and we were just reading it?
Yeah.
It would be night and day. Okay. Yeah. So this person is the same person who pointed out to me that she did not think the jury was receptive at all to some of the witness testimony. And I had not seen that reported by anyone else, anywhere else at any outlet. I never saw any reporting that said the jury seemed to be struggling to believe some of the testimony of some of the witnesses.
How does a jury look? And again, with this, when she was like, oh, they don't look like they believe. What is that? Sort of shaking heads and being like, I don't believe that.
Rolling their eyes while the person's testifying.
Does that happen? It just feels very rude.
Oh, it's a reflex. You can't help it. I mean, could you imagine being in the courtroom with some of the testimony in the Johnny Depp trial and trying to keep a straight face or show a poker face or whatever? But that's why, you remember this. One of the things that alerted the bailiffs to this woman in the courtroom is just how closely she was paying attention to the jurors. Like, it had to be close enough that, and she's making notes. Right.
And all of this was just because she was a fan of Tony Ortega and she wanted to sort of help him out with some stuff?
Oh, no, not at all. That's actually my point, because it's not why she was there. And nobody would have thought that if he hadn't been saying, oh, yes, this person came over and said what a fan she was of mine. And, oh, she saved the story just for me. It's like, what are you doing? That's not why she was there. She was there for her own reasons.
Aaron, and you're calling out Tony Ortega.
Well, I'm calling out any journalist who wants to make themselves a part of the story instead of reporting on the story. I find it inappropriate. That's all. I'm not calling him out specifically, but in this case, I can tell you when he was called up to the sidebar, it was like a celebration. It was like, yay, I finally made it or something. And it was really strange to me. So
I do get like with newspapers do it. They say this was an exclusive for us. We were the ones that were told. And that is quite a big part of being a reporter to an extent.
Well, you're talking about having an exclusive story, and that's fine.
Yeah, fair enough. And do you think he was among the journalists who was maybe painting it differently over the last few weeks to how it actually was?
I think most journalists were getting their notes from him. Was he
the only one in there?
No, unless I've misunderstood, I thought he was the pool reporter.
I don't know what that is.
It was because there's a limited number of reporter seats. So you have one journalist who agrees to go and say, don't worry, guys. He's essentially taking his notes to share with everyone because it's understood not everyone can get in.
Wow. That is open to bias, isn't it? That's the system.
Yes. Now, again, I have some conflicting pieces of information here. It's not like Tony was the only journalist in the courtroom for the entire case. Mm-hmm. And I forget how many seats were allocated for journalists, but I do remember Like if you read Tony's notes every day, he would do some editorializing and then he would say, "We are on the record." From that point on, those are his pool reporter notes.
Okay.
Right.
That is fascinating.
And so, but there were some other journalists there. I mean, it would be hard for anyone to keep as accurate and complete notes as Tony was taking. But I'm just pointing out that none of the media outlets were indicating that there was even anything potentially problematic with the quality or believability of some of the testimony of some of the witnesses. And all I'm saying is that if there had been reporting on that subject, perhaps it wouldn't be such a shock. It would still be a disappointment, but perhaps it wouldn't be such a shock that, 10 people voted not guilty on Jane Doe 1. Like, that's insane.
Yeah.
And yeah,
that blew my mind. I'm absolutely flabbergasted. I mean, why do you think that might be then? Why do you think, is it just like a natural human bias? Maybe whether it be Tony Ortega or any journalist who was in there, they just felt that Danny Masterson was guilty and that was clear as day and that everybody else would feel it? Or do you think there's some sort of like narrative, at play?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't actually hear your question because I have my attention on some of the notes here. Someone saying it's not Tony's job to read the jury. Guys, I'm not saying it's not. I'm not saying Tony didn't report on the jury. That's not what I'm saying. I'm the woman who provided the information, one, provided notes on the jury, and two, provided observations about some of the testimony by some of the witnesses from her own perception. And part of that perception, and part of the information she shared just happened to include how the jury was also responding to some of that testimony. I'm not saying if the media had only reported more about the jurors. That's not what I'm saying at all. Let's not get it confused. Okay, go ahead. Please repeat the question you had for me because I missed it.
Okay, I will do, but I think I've put something for the wrong time for a second. But I will check that in a second for our second part, that is. My question was just about why you think that... Oh, now my camera's gone. But you can hear me. It's one of those days, isn't it? Why whether that would have been like a narrative that someone was pushing, or... not showing that some of the jury didn't agree and all of that thing, or whether that's just a natural human bias?
That's a very good question. I think one of the things that, well, since we're talking about this specific subject, and I have no reason to, pull punches here, Tony is very close to the Scientology subject. He's very close to the people involved in the case. I think it would be hard not to describe Tony as an activist, and journalists don't like being called activists, and activists aren't really journalists. So I'm just saying, when you have someone who's this close to the case and is an anti-Scientology activist, I don't say that derogatorily, I say that descriptively, and they are one of the only source of not the narrative, but the notes of what's going on. I think Tony would be hard pressed to say that any witness was unbelievable. Now maybe that's not fair. Maybe Tony just genuinely felt that they were believable. And I'm not trying to, I'm not trying to say that he specifically held back something that he should have said. I'm not saying that at all. It's not even fair for me to imply that. But what I'm saying is bias can be unconscious, and Tony's very, very close to this. And I think it just is worth keeping in mind that when you have a result that seems so completely out of whack with what you would expect based on the information provided, it's not insane to go, well, expectations here were clearly not managed. What are the various things that could cause that to be, right?
Yeah.
And that's all I'm saying. And I had another source in the courtroom that was giving me significantly different information than what we were getting. And it's one of the pitfalls of having only one primary source of information. And that's just obviously and objectively true.
Yeah, I think what I really like about you, Aaron, apart from your handsome looks, is that we can have this sort of adult conversation where you will say, obviously some of these witnesses were not very believable, but then also that doesn't mean you're saying that they're lying or that it didn't happen. Just,
Exactly.
People are usually so far one way or the other, and you're trying to look at it, I suppose, like a journalist, and I try to look at things like that. And I suppose I'm just I'm repeating that or emphasizing that just so people watching don't think that is what you're saying, or don't, because people do, of course, when you've got thousands of people watching, people will just, oh right, you're saying they're lying, are you? And you're not saying that. But it is interesting.
And I'm not even referring to Jane. I'm not even referring to the named victims in this case. So, and I'm just saying it's totally fair play to say weeks ago, I was receiving a report from the courtroom that was out of step and did not jive with the other information that was coming out of the courtroom, and turned out to be a little more closer to reality in terms of predicting the outcome. That's just a fair statement.
Okay. Yeah, no, it's fascinating. It's a fascinating way to look at it. I've given speeches on exactly just this. I've gone to humanist societies and talked about exactly that, the difference between journalism and activism, and how difficult it is to separate those two things, and to be able to just say like, okay, that's really interesting. And what you've just given us is a fascinating angle that nobody in the world seems to know about unless you're on this channel watching right now. So everyone, do give a like to Erin's beautiful video, because this is about as exclusive as it gets. And it's a fascinating thought that, I guess for some reason, and we won't know until, do we get to hear the jury's deliberation or notes and things like that?
No, not at all. Not at all. And by the way, before anyone gets the idea that I use activist as some sort of a derogatory word, I am an activist.
But you're talking like a journalist today.
Well, just because I can separate my opinion from fact,
That's journalism.
Look, I'm also probably not the one who would be offended by being called an activist. I think it's possible to be a journalist and an activist. I'm just not sure most journalists would agree.
Yeah.
Well, what's your take on it? You live from the journalism world.
Yeah, well, it drives me mad. It drives me mad because almost every other journalist that I know is in some way, incredibly biased, and they're unable to separate their own personal feelings from their writing. I'm so tired of it, and I see it on both sides. Before anyone gets the idea, like, oh, you must be talking about the left or the right or the whatever. It's 100% on both sides, and not just that. Like, there's also this need to jump to conclusions about what someone may or may not have done, instead of just going, hey, I don't know. So I don't know what really happened with Danny Masterson. I can only guess. I've heard what you've said. I've heard what Chris Shelton said and other people, and you guys are like very sure that it happened. But for me to then say that I'm very sure would be to show bias. But then for me, it's a really difficult one for me, because if I then also say, oh, I don't know, it sounds like I'm not supporting those women and believing them, when it does look like, he did do those things, to be honest. So there is a difficult line.
I just realized we're at the time to switch over to your channel.
Let's do that. We got to go over. It should do an automatic thing, everyone, but make sure you like this on the way out, and guys, we'll see you over on my channel.
We're going to continue this conversation over on Andrew Gold's channel, On the Edge with Andrew Gold. When this live stream ends, it should automatically redirect you. So stick around, and we will see you momentarily.